Our reading is taken from Galatians chapter 4, starting at verse 1. What I am saying is that as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave. Although he owns the whole estate, he is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. The Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And since you are a son, God has made you also an heir. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable principles? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. I plead with you, brothers, become like me, for I became like you. You have done me no wrong. As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. Even though my illness was a trial to you, you did not treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself. What has happened to all your joy? I can testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. Have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? Those people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. What they want is to alienate you from us, so that you may be zealous for them. It is fine to be zealous, provided that the purpose is good, and to be so always and not just when I am with you. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, how I wish I could be with you now and change my tone, because I am perplexed about you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Give me a second while I readjust some of this. Okay, you hear me okay like that, yeah? Well, good morning. So my name's Steve. I'm church warden over at Holy Trinity Lionsdown. I'm a member here. Occasionally lead the worship band and play amateur bass guitar. I'm part of the preaching team here. And it's funny how we introduce ourselves, isn't it? With a big list of responsibilities and actions and stuff we do. I could equally kind of start with a list like, hi, I'm Steve. I ran a couple of meetings badly this week. I was lazy when nobody was looking. I struggled to write this sermon. And I don't think I was the best husband at times when I needed to be. Right, both those lists are true. But, you know, we're trying to build credibility, aren't we? I'm standing here trying to help you see why it'd be worth listening to me for the next 20 minutes. But we often define ourselves by this list of actions and responsibilities, basically what we do. You know, when we introduce ourselves, it's, you know, hi, I'm a teacher, I'm retired, I'm a student, I run Knit and Natter. I mean, whatever it is, whether it's a job or an activity, we define ourselves often in that way. And in our passage today, Paul's talking to the Galatian church about how they define themselves. And it's quite an important text, actually. I know through reading it that a lot of our worship songs come from this text. You'll hear a lot of word references to things we sing. No longer slaves. Some of you are old enough to remember a song called Abba Father. I'd actually heard Lily using that in her prayers. Who You Say I Am, which apparently, according to Newslink, is one of Sally's favourite songs. Part of that comes from this passage. So today we're going to learn actually a bit more about the Galatian church, a little bit about the Roman Empire, and a bit about how we should really think about ourselves when we're defining ourselves and actually thinking about our own identity. So, quick bit of story so far. Paul's letter to the Galatians, for those of you that have been following the series, is predominantly about grace. The church itself, the Galatian church, is in modern-day Turkey. And what had happened was Paul had been there. He taught them the gospel. He'd set their theology. And since he'd been there, some Jewish Christians had visited, and they'd been teaching them about Jewish law, routines, traditions. And the Galatians had adopted a lot of these practices. And Paul is using this letter to correct them. And it's an important letter, I think especially for us men, right? Because one of the routines that he's trying to correct here is they'd all gone in for circumcision. And that would be an interesting next men's social, wouldn't it? We're going to breakfast down the railway bell, some bowls, then off to the doctors for a group circumcision. So we're interested in this passage, right? Good reason. We're in the middle section of Paul's letter, and essentially what he's now talking about is really why this is such a big deal. What's the problem with all these routines and traditions and marking special days? Right, today's Trinity Sunday, we're marking that as a special day. Today's Tax Justice Sunday, we have special days, we have traditions. What's the real problem with this? So Paul lays this out really conveniently for us. We're going to focus on the first 11 verses, and there's three key sections to what Paul is saying. In the first 3 verses, we'll see if we can we click through to the next slide? So I'm not getting anything on here. Can you pop us on the next slide, Ross, or whoever's got that? Or if not, just take them off. There we go. Okay. So in the first three verses, which I'll read again. What I'm saying is, as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he owns a whole estate. He is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. So Paul's laying out here to the Galatian church, he's saying before you became Christians at all, you were slaves. Slaves to what? To this thing called the basic principles of the world. The Greek word he used is stoicheia. And it's translated in a few different ways in English versions of the Bible. Elemental spiritual forces, elements of the world, the elemental spirits of the universe. What's he talking about? Well, you can see from the analogy that he gives, right? He starts talking about sons and heirs. He talks about 2 roles in the household. He said, you used to be under guardians and trustees. Guardian is, what he's talking about is in wealthy households, they would have a slave that basically taught the children up to about the age of 7 or 8. That was a guardian. So if you grew up in a fairly wealthy household, you were under the power of that guardian. So whatever morals or views or that guardian had about the right thing to do and how to behave and what to believe, you were under that guardian. As you got older, then there was a household manager, and that's That's what they've translated as trustees. For the scholars amongst you, that's the epitropos, was the guardian, the sort of childcare in the household, and the oikonomos, who's like the household manager. And up to your adult age, you'd then be under the authority of one of those two people. Paul is saying, a child in that setting is effectively like a slave, because your views on things are being shaped by a set of principles that aren't your own, or you can't judge where they have come from. You are under someone else's power. And I think to get to grips with this, you need to think back to times when you are under somebody else's power. Yesterday, when the men went to play bowls, we had this lovely guy in charge, who's great and really nice, but he's very specific about the rules. If the mat was a little off where it should be, he was over. Illegal mat, move the mat 2 inches. And I don't know how everybody else felt, but I was a little bit, oh, come on, the mat's okay. I mean, literally, you've moved it that far. Is it a big deal? I almost wanted to, after he turned his back, move it back to where it was. Don't tell me where to put my mat, But I was on his bowling green, and, he's got that responsibility. But I felt that childlikeness again of being under an authority that you didn't necessarily understand. Why is he the one that tells me where to put the mat? Verse 8, actually, if we have to leap on a bit, Paul expands on about these principles and what they are, and he describes them in a slightly different way, which is interesting. In verse 8, he says, "Formerly when you did not know God, you were slaves," so same point, "to those who by nature are not God's." So he's sort of relating this to how when we're under some other principle or view of norms or cultures, that is effectively like a god, because we're under that authority and we effectively worship that. Remember at this time, the kind of world that Paul existed in was under pretty much entire Roman authority. And there's a lot in this passage, and a lot of the rest of Paul's writing is relating things to Roman culture. And so in researching this, I thought, okay, perhaps when he's talking about the gods who are not gods, he could well be talking about the Roman gods. The Roman gods were effectively a personification of the values that people had at the time and the things that they strove for. So it's quite a good indication of the culture. So we're going to have a little Roman gods quiz for a second. So I'm going to give you the name of a Roman god, and you're going to tell me what they represented, what facet of life that god was linked to. So you can either do this seriously, or if you like panel quiz shows, then you can give me a humorous answer. That's also valid here. Firstly, Venus. Venus was the god of what? Love, yes, or lady shaves, possibly. Okay, what about Minerva? Anyone know Minerva? Wisdom? I heard somebody say wisdom. Very good, somewhere over there. Minerva's a god of wisdom. What about Hermes? Handbags? Not handbags. I like it though. Next day delivery? It's not next day delivery. Messengers? Yeah, you're kind of on the right lines. It's trade. Hermes was the god of trade and business, really. What about Juventus? Yeah. God of Italian football. No. Juventus was the god of youth. You know that one? Vesta? Vesta. Curry? Matches? It's close to the matches. I think Vesta called themselves Vesta for a reason. It's the home or the hearth, the kind of homestead. And Janus, might know this one. Janus? Janus had 2 heads, yeah. Yeah, but was god of money. So again, can we next? There we go. So yeah, there's some of the Roman gods. And actually, I don't know if you recall, some of you will have been here a couple of years ago. We developed our own like modern day list of gods, and I dug those out. If we can put the next slide up, because we put a kind of spin on what would be the Roman gods today if we had them. And this was some of the ones we came up with on the screen there. But the point the point is that, you know, these were the principles of the world that I think Paul is talking about. Effectively, you know, you were slaves to these things. That without these things we felt unsatisfied, and we had to define ourselves by achieving them. If people love us or respect us for our wisdom, or we can achieve youth and fitness or a happy home, money, wealth, status, right? If we can get those things, then we're doing okay. That was the slavery. Then Paul moves on and says, look, you are not under the power of those things anymore, if we can move on. You are now not slaves, you are sons. And this is verses, if you're following the passage, this is verses 4 to 7. God sent his son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full right of sons. Because you are sons, God sent his Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba Father. So he says, following the firstly, the metaphor here is about adoption. When Paul is talking about becoming sons, it's not about being born, right? It's about adopting someone as a son. And if you want to cross-reference that, Paul is making pretty much the same point here he is to the Galatians in a couple of other bits of his writing. Romans 9 verse 4, Romans 3:23, and in the first chapter of Ephesians, he's talking about the same thing, and he very specifically uses the word adoption there. Here he doesn't use the word adoption, but that is the essence. He's not talking about being born. Actually, only Jesus, Peter, and John talk about being born again when we come to faith. Paul never talks about being born again. Paul talks about adoption. And I think he focuses on adoption as the metaphor, again, because he's thinking about the Roman world. At this point in time, when he's writing, Rome spanned from Britain and Spain, you know, right in the west, right across to, you know, Israel, Turkey, over in the east. In fact, I think every bit of the Mediterranean coastline was part of the Roman Empire at that point. So it was, people knew Roman laws and Roman culture. At the time of writing, the people in Galatia and everywhere would have seen the passage of 4 Roman emperors. Okay, Julius Caesar was emperor just before Christ's birth. He passed on to Augustus, who that name will ring a bell because it's in all the Christmas passages we read in the time of Caesar Augustus, around Jesus' birth. Augustus then passed to Tiberius, and come on, Bible school people, after Tiberius, Caligula. Well done, very, very good. Yeah, it was Caligula. Now, but here's the thing, they had something in common, those 4 Roman emperors. And the common factor was adoption. Julius Caesar adopted Augustus. Augustus adopted Tiberius. And Tiberius adopted Caligula. Adoption was common. And adoption was important in the Roman Empire because if you were a father of a son, you had every right to give away that son, disown that son. You could kill your son. That's all fine. But as soon as you adopted a son, that was permanent. You had more rights as an adopted child in Rome than you did as a natural-born child. Romans created those laws, I think, because, childbirth and early child lives were so vulnerable to disease and things like that. You could never guarantee your heir. So what wealthy Romans wanted to do was make a choice. It's a good, strong young lad over there who's now 18. I'll have him as my heir, and they would adopt a son in. So adoption was how, people were chosen for adoption, and heirs were chosen through adoption. Paul is telling the Galatians then, I think, actually 4 important things about being adopted as a son. Number 1, it's permanent. Adoption as a child meant you had absolute rights, and it was forever. 2, it's an inheritance. Everything the Father owns will become yours. And thirdly, it was status, an identity. And fourthly, a name. And Paul is saying to the Galatians, that's what you have received. You were under other powers, but now you are an adopted son. And I keep using the word son. I don't think Paul is being in any way sexist by focusing on the son. He's talking about the son because in Rome, only the son adopted. Daughters didn't. In fact, Paul's being anything but sexist because he says, you are all sons. So whether you're male, female, both or other, right, everybody has that sonship from God. And then final piece that we're looking at is then Paul then is warning the Galatians. He's saying, look, you were slaves under these other principles of the world. Now you're adopted as sons, and you're going back. Right? They're not going back to the old set of rules. They're going to a new set of rules. But the point is they're going back to something that's rules-based, a form of legalism. Or I think, we would probably call it performance Christianity, because it's about what you've done and what you've achieved. If I do the right things, God will like me. If I do enough of the right things, people will respect me. Now, the Jewish laws may perhaps have been a better set of rules than the previous rules, but the point is there's still a set of rules. Both could well be moral. I suspect the Galatian church was a group of moral people before this. Paul's not questioning morality here. In fact, one writer on this passage says this, and this is quite a bold statement. He says, the devil loves your morality. The devil welcomes your morality. Just comes with 2 conditions. Number 1, you do it in your own strength. And number 2, you take the credit. If you've got morality and they're the rules, the devil is super happy. Because performance Christianity like that changes the mission. The goal becomes, I need to do well, I need to be a success. It's not glorifying God. That's why Paul is so strong on this. It's not that following those rules or celebrating those days is innately a bad thing. It's making it the goal and the center of things that is. About 10 years ago, I remember doing a bit of research at work. I worked for a consultancy at the time, and I did a study of the top consultants who sold the most work. And that involved looking at the sales figures. I got a spreadsheet of the sales figures, found the top 30 or however many, I can't remember. And I interviewed them. I thought, we've got to find out why. Why do they sell more than any of the other partners? And what I found was that it was interesting when we're talking about selling. None of them ever seemed to talk or think about selling. That wasn't in their mind at all. Wasn't their mindset. In fact, about 3/4 of them, I think, when I said, how are you doing against your sales target, they didn't know. So I don't know. I don't look at the numbers. What marked them out, though, was firstly, they were technically good at what they did. That was the kind of baseline. But They were interested in meeting people. They were just like natural networkers. And they were inquisitive people. They focused on meeting people. The result was that they sold a lot of work. But it wasn't through setting out to sell work. It was through being interested in meeting other people. And that, for me, that always reminds me of the fact that, that some things can be the result, but they don't always have to be the goal, right? We can live, in morality as a result of our faith. That's not the driver. This is what Paul is saying. Why not? Why is this so bad? Look, if we set out on performance Christianity, we'll fail. Right? We will get it wrong. We'll all be failed Christians if that's the target. God is not asking us to perform. He has adopted us into a sonship that is permanent, where our status is in his identity and heirs of the kingdom. It's the difference between activity and identity. We're defined by who we are, not what we do. So, perhaps, whenever we introduce ourselves to other people and we think about all those things that we do, in our minds at least, perhaps a better way of thinking for ourselves about our introduction is, hi, I'm Steve, I'm your brother, and I'm a child of God. That's who we are, heir to his kingdom. And I think that is a nice thing to sing about. Thank you.